Open. It's somewhere around 50,000 BC and you have a toothache. Not a mild one. Not the kind where you think, I should probably book an appointment. The kind where half your jaw is throbbing, your eye is watering, and you haven't slept properly in 4 days because every time you try to lie down, the pain just gets louder. There's no dentist. There's no ibuprofen. There's no little orange bottle in the cabinet. There's no cabinet. There's no pharmacy. No doctor. No ice pack. No hot water bottle. No 3 a.m. internet rabbit hole about whether it's infected or just sensitive. There's just you, and the pain, and the question of what you're going to do about it. And here's the thing that nobody tells you about ancient humans dealing with pain. They didn't just endure it. They didn't grunt and shrug and walk it off because they were tougher than us. They looked for a way out, just like we do. They just had to find it themselves. And some of what they found is genuinely astonishing. The scale of the problem. Before we get into the solutions, let's understand what ancient humans were actually dealing with, because this isn't a small problem. This is the entire human condition, compressed into a body with no pharmacies, no hospitals, no concept yet that those things could ever exist. Broken bones were constant. Hunting is not a safe hobby. Neither is being hunted. Researchers looking at skeletal remains from prehistoric sites find healed fractures everywhere. Arms, ribs, legs, shoulders. The bones grew back together, which means people survived long enough for that to happen. But they survived in pain, without anything we'd recognize as treatment. Toothaches were probably the single most universal experience of prehistoric human suffering. Here's a number that should stop you cold. At the Cave of Pigeons in Morocco, researchers examined the remains of more than 50 people who lived roughly 15,000 years ago. 94% of them had serious tooth decay. 94. That is essentially everyone. These weren't people who ate a lot of sugar. The culprit was probably a diet heavy in starchy plants and acorns, which ferment against teeth in ways that are quietly devastating. And then there were the injuries that happen when you're essentially living outdoors all the time, in an environment that is actively trying to kill you. Infected wounds, damaged joints, childbirth complications, parasites. Pain was not an occasional inconvenience for ancient humans. It was the background noise of existence. The question is what they did about it. The Neanderthals who self-medicated. Here's where it gets interesting, and I mean that in the way that stops you mid-sentence and makes you sit with it for a moment. In a cave called El Citron, in the mountains of northern Spain, archaeologists found the remains of a group of Neanderthals who lived around 50,000 years ago. And when researchers analyzed the calcified plaque on their teeth, what they found rewrote what we thought we knew about prehistoric medicine. Dental calculus is basically fossilized buildup on teeth. It's not glamorous, but it is extraordinary because it traps a chemical record of everything a person consumed. And in the plaque of one specific Neanderthal at El Citron, researchers found something remarkable. He'd been eating poplar bark. Poplar bark contains salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is the active ingredient in aspirin. This Neanderthal also had an intestinal parasite that causes severe diarrhea. He was sick, he was in pain, and he was eating the one plant in his environment that contained a natural painkiller. The same dental analysis found evidence of chamomile and yarrow consumed by members of the group. Both of these plants are intensely bitter. There's no nutritional reason to eat them. You don't eat yarrow by accident and decide it's delicious. The researchers concluded, in a study published in Nature, that the Neanderthals possessed a, quote, good knowledge of medicinal plants and their various anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties. They were self-medicating. 50,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens had fully settled Europe, before the first cities, before agriculture, before writing, someone was already building a working knowledge of which plants helped and which ones didn't, and they passed that knowledge on. The oldest medicine on Earth. The oldest medicine on Earth. The story of willow bark is one of the longest stories in human history, and most people have no idea it exists. Willow trees produce salicin in their bark. Salicin, when metabolized by the human body, converts into salicylic acid. The same compound the Neanderthals at El Citron were getting from poplar. The same compound that, in 1897, a chemist at Bayer named Felix Hoffmann synthesized into a stable form and called aspirin. But here's the thing. We didn't discover that willow bark relieves pain in 1897. We rediscovered it. In North America, indigenous tribes including the Iroquois, the Cherokee, and the Dakota were using the inner bark of various willow species for at least 10,000 years, brewing it into teas, chewing it raw, using it to bring down fevers, ease joint pain, calm inflammation. In ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, dating to around 1550 BCE, explicitly describes using willow bark as a pain reliever. The Sumerians before them were using it. The ancient Greeks were using it. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, recommended it. Think about that chain. A knowledge of this specific plant, its specific effect on the human body, passed from generation to generation across cultures that had no contact with each other, preserved through oral tradition and eventually through writing, across tens of thousands of years. And then in the 1800s, a pharmaceutical company bottled it and called it a new invention. It wasn't. It was the oldest continuously used medicine in human history. They just finally found a way to make money off it. The joy plant. At approximately the same time the Egyptians were writing about willow bark, the Sumerians, roughly 3400 BCE, were doing something slightly more dramatic. They called it hul gil, the joy plant. We call it the opium poppy. The Sumerians weren't just experimenting, they were cultivating. Growing Papaver somniferum deliberately, harvesting its latex, and using it as medicine. The name they gave it tells you everything about what it did for people who needed it. But here's where the timeline gets stranger. Molecular analysis of pottery residues from Neolithic sites in Europe suggests that humans were processing opium poppies not in 3400 BCE, but as far back as the 6th millennium BCE, more than 7,000 years ago. People were consuming the seeds and latex in contexts that suggest deliberate medicinal use. Pain relief that old, using chemistry that's sophisticated, tells you something about the human animal. We have been searching for ways to make pain stop for longer than civilization itself has existed. The instinct to treat pain isn't modern. It's one of the oldest things about us. Wounded on the hunt. Now let's change the scenario. Because a toothache is one thing, but imagine you're 3 days from camp and a mammoth just caught you with its tusk. This happened regularly. The skeletal record of prehistoric humans is full of healed puncture wounds, healed rib fractures, healed gashes to the bone. These aren't deaths. These are survivals, which means someone dealt with the wound well enough to keep the person alive across days or weeks of travel back to shelter. So what did they do? The evidence, pieced together from prehistoric burial sites and from the practices of isolated hunter-gatherer groups studied before contact with modern medicine, points to a few things. The first was stopping the bleeding. Pressure, packing the wound with whatever was available, animal fat, plant fibers, moss. We actually have a direct example of this. Otzi the Iceman, a man who died roughly 5,300 years ago in the Alps and was preserved in a glacier until 1991, was found with sphagnum moss near his wounds. Sphagnum is highly absorbent, mildly acidic, and slows bacterial growth. It works as a wound dressing. Otzi knew that, or someone who treated him did. Then there was ochre. Red ochre, the iron-rich pigment that prehistoric humans used for everything from cave paintings to burial rituals, has real antibacterial properties. Laboratory studies confirm it inhibits bacterial activity. Researchers have proposed, in peer-reviewed publications, that some of its use wasn't purely symbolic. Whether they packed it on wounds deliberately or stumbled onto the effect by accident, we can't say for certain. But the chemistry worked, and ancient humans were paying close enough attention to what worked to keep doing it. And when none of that worked, there was fire, cauterization, pressing a heated stone or burning coal against an open wound to seal it. No anesthetic, no warning, just the understanding, built up over generations of watching wounds go septic and kill people, that burning the wound shut was better than the alternative. They knew, not scientifically, but they knew. Verklempt nobody talked about. Here is a type of pain that every single prehistoric human group experienced, repeatedly, for hundreds of thousands of years, and that almost never gets discussed when we talk about ancient medicine: childbirth. Every human who has ever lived was born. In the Stone Age, that process happened with no painkillers, no medical staff, no sterile environment, and no guarantee of survival for either person involved. Maternal mortality in prehistoric populations is estimated to have been extraordinarily high. Skeletal analysis of prehistoric female remains shows pelvic stress markers consistent with repeated, difficult deliveries. And yet it kept happening. The species is here, which means prehistoric women developed systems for surviving it. From what researchers can piece together, birth in hunter-gatherer groups was almost never a solitary event. The other women in the group were there. That matters more than it sounds. The presence of experienced women who had been through it, who knew what was normal and what wasn't, who could reposition the mother, support her body, manage a complicated delivery. That was the entire medical system. No tools, no drugs, just accumulated knowledge, passed from woman to woman, about how to keep both people alive. Some groups used specific plant preparations during labor. Others used heat-warmed stones wrapped in animal hide pressed against the lower back. Some used rhythmic motion, walking or rocking, which we now know actually does help manage contraction pain by regulating the nervous system's response. None of it made it painless, but none of them expected it to be. What they expected and what they built was the knowledge to get through it. Beat prehistoric dentistry. Go back to that toothache from the beginning of this video, because some ancient human somewhere was in enough pain that someone else decided to do something about it with a stone tool. In 2026, researchers announced the analysis of a Neanderthal tooth found at Shigirskaya Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, dated to approximately 59,000 years ago. Under microscopic examination, they found that a hole had been drilled into the tooth using a stone tool. The condition of the surrounding enamel indicates the operation was performed to remove infected tissue from a decaying tooth, 59,000 years ago. A Neanderthal, with a stone drill, performing dental surgery. That is the oldest dental procedure ever discovered, and it predates our own species' presence in Siberia by tens of thousands of years, and it wasn't a one-off. Analysis of Neanderthal teeth from sites across Europe shows systematic toothpick grooves, evidence of deliberate cleaning to manage the pain of gum disease. One individual from 130,000 years ago shows signs of repeated, methodical manipulation of multiple teeth over time. Then there's the Neolithic human from Slovenia, about 6,500 years old, whose cracked tooth had been filled with beeswax, smooth, pressed into the cavity while still pliable, an actual dental filling, 4,500 years before the Roman Empire. They couldn't make the tooth stop hurting permanently. But they tried, and they got creative, drilling into the skull. And then there's the option that makes all of the above look mild, trepanation, the practice of boring, cutting, or scraping a hole directly into a living person's skull. The oldest known case dates to approximately 12,000 BCE, found on the banks of the Dnieper River in what is now Ukraine. It predates agriculture, pottery, and any organized religion we know of. It is the oldest confirmed surgical procedure in the archaeological record, and it was widespread. Not rare, not exceptional, widespread. At a burial site in France dated to 6,500 BCE, archaeologists found 120 prehistoric skulls. 40 of them, 1 in 3, had trepanation holes. Researchers have now uncovered more than 1,500 trepan skulls on every inhabited continent: Europe, Russia, China, Peru, North Africa. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you. Many of those skulls show healed bone tissue at the edges of the holes, smooth, rounded edges that form only when a person lives for months or years after a wound. The survival rate for prehistoric trepanation is estimated between 50 and 90%. Someone drilled a hole in their skull with a stone tool. They survived. They lived for years afterward. And archaeologists can prove it because bone doesn't lie. Why? The evidence points to several reasons. Skull fractures from combat or hunting accidents, with trepanation performed to relieve pressure on the brain, seizures, severe migraines, possibly behavioral conditions that without any other framework looked to an ancient healer like something that needed to be released. They had no concept of what a brain was, but they noticed that sometimes, after this procedure, the person got better, and so they kept doing it. For 12,000 years, the oldest painkiller of all. Before the plants, before the surgery, before anything else, there was one painkiller that prehistoric humans had access to everywhere, always, and it cost nothing: cold. Ice Age humans lived in some of the coldest environments our species has ever inhabited. Temperatures regularly dropped far below zero. Rivers froze. The ground was permafrost. And cold, as any athlete who has ever held ice on a sprained ankle knows, is one of the most effective pain relief tools that exists. It numbs nerve endings. It reduces inflammation. It slows the signals that travel from a wound to the brain. Prehistoric humans almost certainly figured this out. Not through theory, through experience. A cut hand submerged in an icy stream that hurt less afterward. A swollen joint packed in snow that became bearable by morning. The connection between cold and relief is not subtle. It's immediate. Any person who encountered it would have noticed. We don't have direct archaeological proof of deliberate cold therapy in the Stone Age, and I want to be honest about that. The evidence doesn't fossilize. You can't find a frozen compress in a burial site. But what we do have is the universal presence of the tool, and the overwhelming evidence that prehistoric humans were intensely practical observers of what worked and what didn't. The idea that they lived surrounded by ice and snow for hundreds of thousands of years and never once noticed that cold made pain better is harder to believe than the alternative. It's also probably the reason why, when you jam your finger today, your first instinct before reaching for the medicine cabinet is to run it under cold water. Some things don't need to be taught, they just get remembered. The thing nobody talks about. Here's the part of this story that lands differently the longer you sit with it. All of this, the plant medicine, the dental work, the surgery, none of it happens in isolation. A 15,000-year-old fractured femur, found at a prehistoric site, had fully healed. A fractured femur, in the prehistoric world, means you cannot walk, you cannot hunt, you cannot gather food, you cannot move when the group moves. If you are alone with a fractured femur in the Stone Age, you die. Full stop. This person didn't die, they healed. Which means someone fed them for weeks, someone stayed, someone chose not to leave. Researchers analyzing the remains of a Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave in Iraq found an individual who had lost the use of one arm, was partially blind, had severe arthritis, and showed evidence of multiple healed crush injuries. This individual was approximately 40 years old, which by Neanderthal standards was elderly. They had survived, and kept surviving, injuries that should have been fatal. Someone cared for them, consistently, over years. Here's what that means. The most powerful pain management tool ancient humans had wasn't a plant or a surgery. It was each other, staying with someone in pain, feeding them, not abandoning them. In the prehistoric world, that wasn't just compassion. It was medicine, and it was the most sophisticated thing they did. Beat. The reframe. We have a very specific image of ancient humans dealing with pain. Stoic, tough, grunting through it because they didn't know any better. The evidence doesn't support that image at all. What the evidence shows is something much closer to what we do. They searched for relief. They experimented. They found what worked and remembered it and passed it to their children. They built proto-medical systems out of observation and necessity and thousands of years of collective memory. The multi-trillion-dollar global pharmaceutical industry, the pain clinics, the opioid crisis, the bottle of aspirin in your cabinet, all of it sits at the end of a chain that starts with a Neanderthal in a cave in northern Spain, sick and hurting, chewing poplar bark because experience had taught him it helped. That's not primitive. That's the same impulse we have. We just have more options. And looking at some of the options we've ended up with, it's not completely clear we've always handled it better than they did. The honest answer. So, how did ancient humans deal with pain? The honest answer is that we don't know the full picture. We know what survived: bones, calcified dental plaque, pottery residue, written records starting around 3000 BCE. That's a fraction of what was actually happening. Every herbal treatment passed down verbally and then lost. Every technique that left no physical trace. What we know for certain is this: humans have been trying to escape pain for at least as long as we've been human, possibly longer, because the Neanderthals were doing it before us. The pharmacopoeia they built, plant by plant, wound by wound, generation by generation, is the foundation of every painkiller that exists today. The aspirin in your cabinet is willow bark, refined. The opioids in a hospital are poppy, processed. The antibiotics that treat infected wounds descend from observations about molds, the same kind of mold found in Neanderthal dental plaque that killed bacteria. They didn't have the science, but they had the data, and they used it. So next time you have a headache and you shake 2 aspirin out of a bottle without thinking about it, think about it for a second. Think about the Neanderthal at El Cedron, 50,000 years ago, sick and in pain, who reached for the one plant in his world that made things a little quieter. Think about the person in Neolithic France with a fractured leg who lay still for weeks while someone they loved brought them food and didn't leave. Think about the Stone Age healer somewhere in Ukraine 12,000 years ago, holding a flint tool, about to do something that had never been done before because the person in front of them had nothing left to lose. They were doing exactly what you would do, looking for relief, looking for something that works, trying to make it stop. The only difference is you found it in a bottle. They had to find it in the world, and they did. If you've ever been in serious pain and had someone stay with you through it, drop it in the comments. Because as it turns out, that might be the oldest medicine there is. I'll see you in the next one.